When Evelyn arrived in Windermere, she was seeking a fresh start. The town's wide avenues lined with centuries-old oaks felt quiet, almost tranquil. Though her new neighbors greeted her with polite nods, she sensed an undercurrent of caution whenever they spoke of a certain property near the eastern edge of town. The whispers hinted at something ominous lurking beneath its charm. Yet, when Evelyn laid eyes on the old Victorian house, she felt drawn to it. Its faded gables and intricate woodwork seemed to promise a slice of history she could call her own. Early on, the house felt comforting, even if it groaned from age. The stairs creaked under her feet, and the radiators hissed at odd intervals. Evelyn found these quirks endearing, reminders that the house had lived through countless seasons before her. Yet one detail stood out. A thick iron drain in the basement floor, positioned at the center of the room as if deliberately placed to capture attention. She noticed it on move-in day, but at first, it was just another artifact of a bygone era, its circular grate peppered with rust. As the first few weeks passed, Evelyn settled into her new routine. By day, she explored the sleepy streets of Windermere, dining at a small cafe on Main, visiting the dusty library with its antique wooden shelves, and greeting neighbors who seemed hesitant to do more than wave hello. By night, the house lulled her with the rhythmic creaks of cooling pipes, until the moment she heard something else. A distant, muffled whisper. It persisted each evening after the lights went out, and she discovered it came from below, as if the basement itself was murmuring secrets. At first, she tried to write it off. Old homes have a tendency to make strange noises. Sighing wood, rattling windows, the hum of plumbing. But these whispers felt intelligible, like someone was struggling to form words. She ventured downstairs a few times, flashlight in hand, to pinpoint the noise. Each time she reached the bottom of the steps, it would subside to near silence, leaving her feeling silly for imagining things. It wasn't until a midwinter thunderstorm rolled in one evening, rattling the window panes and sending rainwater rushing through the gutters, that the whisper became impossible to ignore. Evelyn was woken by a steady series of soft cries echoing through the floorboards. She bolted upright in bed. After gathering her courage, she descended into the basement once more. This time the sound wasn't faint, it was urgent, a plea. The old drain seemed to emanate sorrowful sobs as though something were trapped inside, begging to be let out. Shaken, Evelyn returned upstairs, determined to find answers. The next morning, fueled by lack of sleep and rising anxiety, she headed to the local library. The town's archives offered a treasure trove of old newspaper articles, property records, and yellowed legal documents. She spent hours flipping through delicate pages that spoke of Windermere's past, floods and celebrations, births and obituaries, all the mundane and notable events of a small town's life. Then she found something, a mention of the house she had purchased, accompanied by the word tragedy. A century earlier, the building belonged to a prominent family, the Morleys, who were rumored to have dabbled in seances and spiritual rites. Neighbors gossiped that they'd brought something into this world that refused to leave. Another article, dated decades later, recounted disappearances tied to the property, though the details were vague. Witnesses insisted the basement contained a drain that led to more than just sewage pipes. Whispers abounded of shadowy apparitions, sudden cold spots, and in one chilling paragraph, a description of a child's voice crying for help in the night. Evelyn's hands shook as she read. She tried to rationalize it. Small towns often exaggerate stories for dramatic effect. But then the article described precisely the same kind of drain that sat in her own basement. The possibility that these documents might be more than mere legends unsettled her deeply. As nights turned to weeks, the ominous basement calls grew bolder. What began as faint whispers morphed into distinct cries. Sometimes they sounded like a child, other times like a chorus of tormented voices. They escalated to the point where Evelyn could hardly rest. She started sleeping with the lights on, jumping at every tiny sound. The house that had felt so welcoming now felt oppressive, each room seeming to watch her. Desperation clawed at her mind. She tried covering the drain with heavy blankets, stacking boxes on top of it, anything to dull the cries. But the coverings never stayed put. By morning, the drain would be uncovered, the blanket shoved aside, or the boxes toppled. On certain nights, the entire basement smelled of damp earth, its walls slick with condensation that hadn't been there before. The next day, it would be perfectly dry, leaving Evelyn doubting her own senses. Ultimately, she decided that she had to confront whatever dark force lurked beneath her home. The torment had grown too intense for half measures. She reached out to a local historian, Mr. Caldwell, who claimed to have studied the Morley family in detail. Sitting in his musty study, he revealed old diaries and sketches that hinted at rituals performed in that very basement. Rituals designed to open a gate between worlds. The drain, he explained, was never just a drain. It had once been a sealed well, until the Morleys tampered with it. It said that any soul lost in that place, Mr. Caldwell noted gravely, never truly leaves. They become part of something else. If the drain is reactivated by enough energy, anger, fear, desperation, it might pull more life in. You need to be very careful. But caution was a luxury Evelyn no longer possessed. The voices plagued her every moment, echoing at the edges of her consciousness, even in broad daylight. She found herself losing track of time, drawn repeatedly to the basement steps in a trance-like state. On more than one occasion, she caught herself standing over the drain, unable to remember how she got there, her ears filled with faint sobbing. The final straw came one gray, storm-lashed evening when the power went out. Lightning illuminated the windows for brief, terrifying flashes. Shadows danced along the walls, elongating and twisting in bizarre shapes. That was the night the cries turned to screams. Desperate, wailing screams that pounded against Evelyn's skull. She felt certain that if she didn't act, she would lose her mind entirely. She grabbed the strongest flashlight she had, plus a pry bar from her toolbox. She set up a circle of candles for light, though their flickering glow only emphasized how dark and menacing the basement corners were. The air itself felt thick, charged with static. As she stepped onto the basement floor, thunder boomed and the drain seemed to pulsate, glowing with a faint, sickly light. Evelyn approached, forcing herself to stay calm. If there was a way to seal whatever portal had been opened, she intended to find it. She knelt beside the iron grate, determined to pry it loose. The metal was cold to the touch, slick with condensation. Pulling with all her might, she felt the ancient bolts resisting, but something in the drain wanted out even more than she wanted it sealed. The grate wrenched from her hands, snapping back with a clang that echoed like a scream of metal. A blinding flash of lightning illuminated the basement through the narrow windows. The drain suddenly radiated an otherworldly glow, like moonlight reflected on black water. Instead of peering into a dark hole, Evelyn found herself staring into what looked like a boundless void of swirling shadows. At its edges, she could see faint, indistinct shapes, faces contorted in agony reaching up, opening and closing mouths in silent pleas. She heard them, distinct and horrifying, their wails emerging like a cacophony. The house seemed to shake. In that moment, everything, the rotting wood beams, the ancient foundation, felt alive with malevolence. Evelyn tried to back away, but an icy gust of wind erupted from the hole, knocking her down. The drain gurgled as if thirsting. Suddenly, a clammy hand, a nightmarish, half-decayed appendage, shot out from the void, wrapping around her wrist. Evelyn shrieked in pure terror, candle flames dancing erratically around her. She struggled, trying to break free. The hand's grip was unyielding, painfully strong. Soon more hands emerged, skeletal fingers, rotted flesh, all clawing upward to drag her down. In a final desperate act, Evelyn flailed her flashlight wildly. She managed to slam its heavy end onto one of the bony grips. She felt rather than heard a sickening crunch, but the creature didn't let go. Another surge of wind whipped through the room, flinging boxes and tools across the basement. Dark silhouettes crawled toward the lip of the drain, their hollow eyes fixed on her. The drain, which had once whispered soft pleas, now roared with a voracious hunger. A swirl of fog and shadows spiraled around it, creating a vortex that pulled at Evelyn's legs. She screamed, legs scrabbling uselessly against the floor. Her free hand grappled for anything to hold on to. A pipe, the edge of a shelving unit, but the suction was too powerful. With a final echoing shriek, Evelyn was yanked into the churning darkness. The basement fell silent as the vortex collapsed. Every candle extinguished, plunging the space into an impenetrable gloom. Rain still battered the windows upstairs, but down below it was as though nothing had ever stirred. When the storm cleared the next morning, neighbors noticed Evelyn's house stood unsettlingly quiet. Her car was in the driveway, but the curtains were drawn. Days passed without a single light turning on. Finally, a concerned acquaintance mustered the courage to knock on the door. Finding it unlocked, he ventured inside, calling Evelyn's name. The house was in disarray, furniture overturned, pictures askew on the walls. The basement door stood ajar, exuding a damp chill that made his skin crawl. He descended into the basement, the flashlight quivering in his hand. Nothing moved. The walls were cracked, water-stained, and a thin layer of dust coated the floor. It was almost as if a fierce wind had scoured the place clean. But of Evelyn, there was no sign. He saw her scattered candles, some upturned boxes, and a few tools lying around. Everything was silent, except for a faint, rhythmic dripping. When he stepped closer, he noticed the drain, wide open, flecks of rust around its rim. He sensed something terrible had happened. Yet no matter how long he waited, or how loudly he called, there was no response from within that yawning maw. Word soon spread through Windermere that Evelyn had vanished. Some whispered that she had simply left town. Others, recalling the house's ominous past, spoke in hushed tones of gates to other worlds and vengeful spirits. The local police treated it as a missing persons case, though they found no trace of her. In the end, only the old legends remained, and the unsettling drain that might have claimed yet another life. Months later, a distant relative inherited the house. Upon arrival, he refused to set foot beyond the threshold once he learned of the tales. Instead, he boarded up the doors and windows, leaving the property in a state of permanent abandonment. Rumors claimed that sometimes on stormy nights, passers-by could still hear faint sobbing echoes, but few dared approach, haunted by the memory of Evelyn's screams. As the years passed, the house became a forbidden spot where kids dared each other to sneak in. Those that tried rarely made it past the front porch, unnerved by the house's aura of menace. The drain remained below, silent yet watchful, ready to whisper once more whenever a fragile soul roamed too close, luring them into an abyss from which there was no return. And so the story of the Whispering Drain evolved into local folklore, a chilling testament to the horrors that can lie hidden in the most ordinary places. For in Windermere, everyone understood a simple, terrifying truth. Some doors once opened refused to close, and some drains once awakened hunger for more.